Picture this, the grand stage of the UN, where leaders usually arrive with neatly typed scripts, polished talking points, and enough diplomatic jargon to put half the room to sleep. You know the drill. Phrases like, in the spirit of cooperation, or we encourage dialogue. Basically, the kind of language designed to say absolutely nothing while sounding very important. And then walks in Ibrahim Traoré. No cue cards, no teleprompter, no stiff notes handed over by advisors in suits. Instead, the man carried something far more dangerous, the truth, straight from the gut. Now, why is this so shocking? Because in the world of politics, unscripted equals risky. Every word counts. A misplaced phrase can cause a scandal, tank markets, or trigger diplomatic chaos. That's why most leaders are terrified to go off script. They cling to speeches like a drowning man clings to a life vest. But Traoré, he threw that life vest out the window. He didn't just speak, he exploded. It's like walking into a room full of glassware with a sledgehammer. Everyone expected the usual polite tapping on the table. Instead, Traoré smashed the silence into 1,000 pieces. And in doing so, he reminded the world that Africa's voice doesn't need a teleprompter. It needs conviction. Let's slow down for a second because the symbolism here is massive. When Traoré ditched the paper, he was making a statement bigger than his words. We don't need permission, we don't need polish, and we don't need anyone else's lines. We speak for ourselves. That's a game changer. For decades, African leaders at the UN often played it safe. They followed the diplomatic dance, nod, smile, drop a mild complaint, then thank the assembly for their attention. Translation, don't ruffle feathers, especially the feathers of big powers holding the purse strings. But Traoré, he basically said, forget your purse strings. I've got my own rope. And in that moment, millions watching online realized this wasn't going to be another sleepy UN address. This was going to be a wake-up call. Think back. How often have African leaders been framed as junior partners in global politics? Too often. And part of that comes from optics. A scripted speech reinforces the idea of control. It's neat, it's managed, it's, well, boring. But unscripted, that's dangerous energy. That's fire. That's real leadership, especially in a world tired of plastic politicians. By refusing the script, Traoré tapped into something raw. He became less of a politician and more of a truth teller, a role historically reserved for revolutionaries. It echoes the energy of Thomas Sankara, also from Burkina Faso, who once stunned the UN by condemning debt and exploitation without sugarcoating his words. Traoré's no-script moment was like Sankara's spirit resurrected with 21st century urgency. Now, let's be real. This wasn't just brave. It was risky. One wrong word, one misstep, and critics would have torn him apart. Western media would have painted him as reckless, unprofessional, unfit. And Israel? They would have pounced on any slip as proof he couldn't lead. But here's the beauty. He didn't slip. He spoke with clarity, intensity, and rhythm. No ums, no stumbles, just the kind of raw delivery that makes people sit up straighter in their chairs. Think about it. A scripted leader sounds like a politician. An unscripted leader sounds like a man ready to fight for something real. And that difference is why Traoré's first shock at the UN wasn't even what he said. It was how he said it. You could feel the tension ripple through the room. Diplomats who expected another polite African complaint suddenly realized they were listening to a declaration that said, Africa is awake and we're done being polite about it. That's the kind of energy you can't manufacture on paper. You can't rehearse it in a mirror. It has to come from the heart, and that's why it hit differently. And just when the room thought, wow, that was bold, Traoré raised the stakes. Because his next move wasn't about vague principles or broad ideas. Nope, he went for the jugular and called out Netanyahu directly. And trust me, that's where things get explosive. Most politicians love dancing around names. They'll say things like certain actors or some nations, basically playing guess who with global politics. It's safer that way. You get to sound tough without actually angering anyone important. But Ibrahim Traoré? Oh no, he didn't bring a riddle to the UN. He brought receipts, and he read the name on the label loud and clear. Benjamin Netanyahu. That's right. No polite dodging, no diplomatic smokescreens. He looked straight into the camera, straight into the living rooms of millions worldwide, and basically said, Mr. Netanyahu, I see you, and Africa is not here to take your threats. Now let's pause here, because this was nuclear-level bold. Calling out the Prime Minister of Israel in front of the UN is not the kind of thing you do casually. Like ordering coffee. This is Israel we're talking about, a country with deep ties to Western powers, strong influence in international affairs, and a leader not exactly known for staying quiet when criticized. And yet, Traoré didn't flinch. No hesitation, no backpedaling. He planted his feet, raised his voice, and made it crystal clear. Burkina Faso answers to no one, not to Tel Aviv, not to Washington, not to any so-called big power. That wasn't just a statement, that was a revolution in a sentence. Let's be honest, the UN has seen plenty of fiery speeches. Leaders from Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, many have taken swipes at the West or Israel over the years. But here's the difference. Traoré wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso, he was carrying the weight of an entire continent's frustration. It's like the difference between a boxer swinging for himself and a boxer swinging for his whole family. Every punch lands harder because it's backed by generations of pain and pride. When he said Burkina Faso does not answer to Tel Aviv or Washington, he wasn't just rejecting one leader's threats, he was ripping up a centuries-old script that cast Africa as the junior partner in world affairs. He was saying, we're not your colony anymore, we're not your pawns, and we won't be bullied into submission. That's not just a warning to Netanyahu. That's a warning to every power that ever thought Africa was a playground. To really understand the weight of this moment, you have to see it against history. For decades, African leaders often avoided naming names at the UN. Why? Because aid money, military deals, and trade relationships depended on keeping friends in high places. Take the Cold War era. African nations were constantly pressured to choose sides, east or west. Many leaders gave carefully balanced speeches to avoid angering either superpower. Words were measured, names were avoided. But Traoré shattered that tradition. By calling out Netanyahu by name, he did what many before him wouldn't dare. He risked backlash, sanctions, or worse. And in so doing, he became a symbol of the new Africa, a continent no longer willing to tiptoe around global bullies. Now, let's zoom in on why Netanyahu specifically. According to reports, Netanyahu allegedly warned African leaders to stay in line or face consequences. Whether he said it or not almost doesn't matter, because the message was clear. Don't defy us or you'll pay the price. And Traoré's response was, we don't care if you said it, because the idea itself is an insult. Africa doesn't take orders anymore. That's huge, because in geopolitics, perception often matters more than reality. Even the hint of a threat from a leader like Netanyahu sends ripples, and Traoré used that ripple to create a tidal wave of defiance. It's like someone trying to flick your forehead, and instead you grab their whole arm and say, try that again, I dare you. The UN chamber isn't used to that kind of directness. Diplomats love vague language. It keeps things civil. But when Traoré named Netanyahu, you could almost feel the oxygen level drop in the room. Heads turn,
Pens froze mid-note, translators probably thinking, wait, did he actually just say that? Yes, he did. And the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was electric. Because deep down, many nations, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, have felt the same frustration for decades. They just didn't say it out loud. Traoré did. And in that silence, they knew someone had finally voiced what they'd been whispering all along. Let's not sugarcoat this. Traoré's boldness came with serious risks. Israel is not just any country, it's a major player with alliances that run deep. Calling out Netanyahu by name could have isolated Burkina Faso, costed international support, or even invited retaliation. But here's the twist. Instead of isolating him, it made him a hero. Across Africa, leaders and citizens alike started echoing his message. His defiance didn't weaken him, it amplified him. And that's the paradox of courage. Sometimes the very act that looks like political suicide ends up breathing life into a movement. We've got to mention this. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, also stood at international podiums and called out global hypocrisy without fear. Traoré's moment was a chilling echo of that legacy. Both men refused to bow, both men spoke in ways that rattled the powerful, and both men lit a fire that burned far beyond their borders. For Burkina Faso, this isn't just politics, it's heritage. It's a continuation of a legacy of defiance, reborn in the 21st century. Let's peel back the layers. By calling Netanyahu, Traoré wasn't just rejecting one threat. He was redefining Africa's role in the world. He was saying, we don't need to play by your script. We're writing our own. And that's why his words weren't just bold, they were historic. And if you thought naming Netanyahu was the peak, oh no, Traoré was just warming up. Because his next move wasn't just about individuals anymore. It was about drawing a line in the sand for the entire continent. His warning? Attack one African nation and you'll have to face them all.
Here's where things go from bold to downright seismic. It's one thing for Traoré to stand at the UN and speak from the heart with no script. That alone made people sit up straight. It's another thing entirely to call out Netanyahu by name, staring directly into the cameras like he was sending a personal WhatsApp message to the Prime Minister of Israel. But then he dropped the bombshell. If you come for one of us, you come for all of us. Let's pause. Let that echo in your head for a second, because those aren't just words. That's a battle cry. That's a declaration of continental unity in a place where division has too often been the rule of the game.
You know how in superhero movies, there's always that scene where the underdogs finally stop fighting alone and form a team? Think of the Avengers putting aside their egos, or Justice League showing up together for the first time. That's exactly the vibe Traoré brought into reality with his announcement of the Sahel Alliance. Except, here's the twist. This isn't fiction. This isn't capes and CGI. This is Africa. Real leaders, real nations, and real stakes. Because when Traoré stood at the UN and warned foreign powers, it wasn't just talk. It was backed by an actual alliance already forming on the ground. A pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger that basically says, if you mess with one of us, you're messing with all of us. And that, my friends, is how you turn fiery rhetoric into strategy. For decades, Africa's been kept weak by fragmentation. Colonial borders chopped communities apart. Foreign influence fueled coups and rivalries. Even today, international institutions love dealing with African nations one by one. It's easier to control that way. But the Sahel Alliance flips the chessboard. Suddenly, 3 nations, neighbors, brothers, are banding together. That's not 3 voices, it's one chorus.
Not 3 militaries, it's one shield. Not 3 economies, it's one bargaining table. And the psychology of that is massive. Because here's the truth. In geopolitics, unity is the ultimate power move. NATO exists because Western nations realized they couldn't stand alone against threats. The EU exists because Europe realized unity meant leverage. The BRICS bloc exists because emerging economies saw they'd be stronger together. Now Africa is finally taking a page from the same playbook. Let's zoom out on a map. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. Together, they form the beating heart of the Sahel, a stretch of land that cuts right across the middle of Africa. This region isn't just symbolic, it's strategic. It's rich in resources, gold, uranium, oil. It's home to millions of young people hungry for change. And it sits at a crossroads that links West Africa to North Africa, and by extension to Europe and the Middle East. Translation: whoever controls the Sahel controls the narrative. And for the first time in modern history, the people of the Sahel are saying, we control ourselves. Here's where things get even spicier. Each of these nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, recently made bold moves to kick out old colonial powers. Mali said goodbye to French military bases. Burkina Faso followed suit, showing Paris the door. Niger took the step of expelling French troops and reclaiming its sovereignty. That's not coincidental. That's coordination. These weren't isolated tantrums. They were steps toward building something new. And that something is the Sahel Alliance. An alliance built not on dependency, but on defiance.
Some statements are polite reminders. Others are polite threats. But Ibrahim Traoré's next line? That was neither. That was a thunderclap, a lightning strike across history. Standing at the UN podium, he declared with the force of a man channeling generations of anger, "We are not your colony. We are not your pawns. We are sovereign, and we will fight for our freedom with everything we've got." Boom. The kind of boom that shakes dust off old colonial statues still standing in European capitals. The kind of boom that makes history professors smile and foreign ministers sweat. Now, you might think, we've heard this before. Haven't African leaders always said they're free and sovereign? Sure. The words sovereignty and independence get thrown around in speeches every year. But here's the difference. Most times, those speeches are laced with thank yous to the very powers that exploited Africa. We are independent and we thank our partners for their continued support. Translation: we're free. Kind of. But Traoré didn't sugarcoat. No backhanded compliments, no diplomatic thank yous to the colonizers of yesterday or the neo-colonizers of today. Instead, he delivered a cold, unfiltered truth bomb. Africa isn't a playground. Africa isn't for sale. Africa isn't anyone's backyard. To really appreciate this, you've got to understand how colonialism never truly left Africa. Sure, the flags came down in the 1960s. The European governors sailed home. National anthems replaced God Save the Queen or La Marseillaise. But did the exploitation end? Nope. It just changed its outfit. Economic colonialism. Foreign companies still control Africa's mines, oil wells, and farmland. Military colonialism. Western powers still keep bases on African soil supposedly to protect, but often to control. Cultural colonialism. African history is still told through European textbooks. African art still sits in European museums. And African voices are still filtered through Western media. So when Traoré declared Africa isn't a colony anymore, he wasn't just rejecting history.
He was rejecting the present. He was calling out the silent change that still exists. And then came the word that made chess players everywhere nod: pawns. For centuries, Africa was treated like the pawns of geopolitics. Cheap, disposable, moved around the board by kings and queens who never risked themselves. Wars were fought on African soil, resources extracted, people enslaved, while the real players sipped tea in European capitals. By saying we are not your pawns, Traoré flipped the board. He wasn't just declaring independence, he was declaring that Africa is finally a player, not a piece. That's the moment the chessboard cracked. Let's be real, this line wasn't just for Netanyahu. It was for Paris, for Washington, for London, for every capital that still thinks of Africa as an extension of its empire. Traoré was basically saying, we see you, we see your games, and we're not playing anymore. That's dangerous talk in global politics. Dangerous because it challenges the entire structure of how the world economy and military power has been organized for centuries. And that's why it mattered so much. Once again, you can feel the spirit of Thomas Sankara hovering in the room. Back in the 1980s, Sankara famously said, "We must choose either champagne for a few or safe drinking water for all." He wasn't afraid to call out colonial legacies, whether economic or cultural. Traoré's declaration felt like a continuation of that same fire. Burkina Faso once again reminding the world that African dignity is not up for negotiation. Eyewitnesses described the room going tense. Because here's the thing, diplomats don't like blunt truths. They like diplomacy, code words, polite nods. But Traoré didn't give them diplomacy. He gave them defiance. And you could almost hear the collective gasp in the air. It wasn't the words alone, it was the way he delivered them. Fierce, unapologetic, almost daring anyone in the room to challenge him. Spoiler, no one did. Let's break it down. When Africa insists it's not a colony anymore, here's what it really means. No more cheap labor. Western corporations can't rely on sweatshops and underpaid miners forever. No more exploitative deals. Those aid packages tied with strings, they won't fly much longer. No more military bases without consent. The age of permanent foreign troops on African soil is fading. No more being silent in global politics. Africa's demanding a seat at the table, not as a guest, but as an equal. That's terrifying if your entire empire depends on keeping Africa dependent. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is just to say no. No to being treated like children, no to being managed like resources, no to being threatened into silence. Traoré's statement was essentially Africa's collective no, and that word carries power, because once it's spoken, it's contagious. Other leaders hear it, citizens feel it, movements grow from it. No is how empires collapse. For Africa's youth, this wasn't just politics, it was personal. Imagine being 20 years old in Burkina Faso or Mali or Niger. Your parents lived under corrupt regimes tied to foreign powers. Your grandparents lived under colonial rule. And now you're hearing a leader tell the world, we are not your pawns. That's not just inspiring, it's identity shaping. It tells you that your future doesn't have to look like your past. And that's why young Africans aren't just listening to Traoré. They're amplifying him because he's saying what they've been shouting in streets and classrooms for years. Picture it like this. Traoré's words hang in the UN chamber, heavy as iron. The camera pans across rows of diplomats shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Then it cuts to Africa, crowded markets in Lagos, dusty roads in Bamako, bustling cafes in Nairobi, where people watch on their phones, nodding, cheering, clapping. The disconnect is striking. In the halls of power, His words made people nervous. On the streets of Africa, they made people proud. And that's the moment you realize this isn't just a speech, it's a split screen in history. So let's be clear. When Traoré declared Africa isn't a colony anymore, he wasn't stating the obvious. He was ripping open the scars of history, pointing to the hidden chains of the present, and promising a future where Africa decides its own destiny. It was more than words. It was defiance. It was dignity. It was Africa standing tall and saying, "We are free and we intend to act like it." And here's where things got even stranger. After that defiance, after those declarations, everyone waited for Israel's response. Surely Netanyahu would clap back, right? Wrong. What came instead was silence. And that silence spoke louder than any words.
In politics, there's an unwritten rule. If someone calls you out on the world stage, you clap back hard. You issue a statement, you deny, you deflect, you drown the headlines with your narrative before theirs can catch fire. That's crisis management 101. So when Traoré looked into the cameras at the UN and told Netanyahu point blank, Burkina Faso does not answer to Tel Aviv, the world braced itself for Israel's retaliation. A fiery press release, a harsh rebuke, maybe even a diplomatic snub. But what came instead? Nothing. No tweets, no official statements, no dramatic speeches in return, not even a generic, "we reject these baseless claims." Israel went radio silent. And in geopolitics, silence isn't absence, it's presence. It's noise of a different kind. Let's break this down. In global politics, silence often signals one of three things: shock, they didn't see it coming and don't know how to respond; strategy, they think ignoring it will kill the story faster than engaging; weakness, they actually don't have a good counterargument. Which one applies here? That's the million-dollar question. Because when a small West African nation openly calls out Israel, a country with strong military, financial, and diplomatic ties to global powers, you'd expect a thunderous comeback. The fact that none came makes the silence itself historic. Let's start with the obvious. Traoré's speech blindsided Israel. Netanyahu's brand is all about projecting strength, control, dominance. He's used to critics, sure, but critics from African nations on the UN stage? That's new. For decades, Israel cultivated ties with African leaders, offering aid, tech, and security cooperation in exchange for loyalty. The unspoken rule was you don't publicly shame Israel, and in return, Israel helps you out behind the scenes. But Traoré ripped that script in half. And the silence that followed may have been sheer surprise, Israel realizing they'd been hit from a direction they didn't expect. But then again, maybe it wasn't shock. Maybe it was strategy. Silence can sometimes be a way of smothering a fire. Don't add oxygen, don't fuel the flames, let it burn out on its own. Think about it. If Israel had responded, headlines would have multiplied. News outlets would have pitted the two leaders against each other in endless coverage. Instead, by staying silent, Israel may have hoped the world would just shrug and move on. It's the political version of "don't feed the trolls." But here's the catch. Traoré wasn't a troll. He was voicing an African's frustrations, and silence didn't kill the story. It amplified it. And then there's the most uncomfortable possibility. Israel stayed silent because it couldn't defend itself without admitting something. How do you respond when someone says, "Africa isn't your colony. Africa won't be bullied"? Denying it makes you look guilty. Confirming it makes you look worse. So maybe the silence was less strategy and more paralysis. Because here's the thing. Traoré wasn't just pointing at Israel. He was pointing at every global power that's treated Africa like a pawn. And in that moment, Israel had no clean way out. Here's where this gets cinematic. Picture the split screen. On one side, Traoré pounding the podium at the UN,
fiery and fearless. On the other, Netanyahu's office in Tel Aviv, silent phones, no statements, no tweets. The optics are brutal. One side looks bold and alive, the other looks cornered and muted. And optics matter in politics. They shape perception, and perception shapes power. In that silence, Traoré didn't just win the exchange, he owned it. Now let's flip perspectives. For Africans watching, Israel's silence wasn't just awkward, it was empowering. It proved something Traoré had been saying all along, that Africa doesn't have to bow, that even the mighty can be shaken into silence. Think about how rare that is. For centuries, African leaders were the ones silenced, bullied, bribed, or threatened into quiet compliance. Suddenly, the script flipped. The colonizer figure went quiet. The African leader roared. That's a seismic shift psychologically. Here's another layer. Western media barely touched this silence. And why would they? Covering Traoré's speech already made their narrative uncomfortable. Covering Israel's lack of response would have been worse. Because silence is news. Silence is suspicious. Silence suggests the critic struck a nerve. So instead of analyzing why Netanyahu stayed quiet, most Western outlets did what they do best: bury the story under other headlines. But in Africa, people noticed, people remembered, and people shared. There's a saying in law: silence can be taken as consent. In politics, silence can be taken as acknowledgement. By not responding, Israel unintentionally validated Traoré's words. It was as if the silence itself whispered, "We can't deny it, so we won't." And in that sense, silence became more powerful than a rebuttal ever could have been. Of course, Africans didn't miss the chance to have some fun with this silence. Memes exploded online. One showed Netanyahu with duct tape over his mouth captioned, "When Traoré speaks, you listen." Another showed the UN chamber with Traoré on one side and a ghost chair labeled "Israel's response" on the other. Funny, yes, but also biting. Humor became another way of saying, even your silence proves our point. Behind the scenes, you can bet this silence created ripples. African leaders saw it as proof they could be boldered. If Traoré could call out Israel and face no direct retaliation, maybe they could too. Meanwhile, foreign powers likely saw it as a warning. If they pushed too hard, they risked the same treatment: public shaming followed by viral silence. That kind of precedent changes the game. Imagine the soundtrack here. Traoré drops his fiery lines, the room goes still, the camera pans to the Israeli delegation, stone-faced, scribbling notes, avoiding eye contact. The music swells, but no words come. Fade to black. Silence. That silence is deafening. So let's be clear. Israel's silence wasn't just the absence of words. It was the presence of power. African power. It showed that sometimes the loudest victory comes not from what your opponent says, but from what they can't say. And in that moment, Traoré didn't just silence Netanyahu. He silenced a system that's been talking down to Africa for centuries. But silence wasn't the only reaction. While Israel zipped its lips, another player tried to downplay the story: the Western media. And their half-hearted coverage, or lack thereof, revealed just how threatened they are by Africa's new narrative.
If you ever want to know what truly rattles the West, watch what they don't cover. Because here's the thing. Ibrahim Traoré's speech at the UN was electric. It was bold. It was historic. It called out Netanyahu by name, declared Africa's independence, and lit up social media like a wildfire. You'd think CNN, BBC, the New York Times, and every other world-leading outlet would be all over it. But what happened? Cue the crickets. The story got barely a whisper, a tiny headline here, a brief mention there, quickly buried under stories about celebrity divorces, Wall Street jitters, or some European election no one outside Europe even cares about. And that shrug, that deliberate downplaying, says more than 1,000 editorials. There are 3 reasons why Western outlets treated Traoré's speech like background noise.
It breaks their script. For decades, Africa has been portrayed in Western media as weak, dependent, chaotic. A defiant Africa doesn't fit the narrative. It risks encouragement. Broadcasting Traoré's speech widely would inspire others, not just in Africa, but across the global south, to push back. And the West doesn't want that spark spreading. It challenges power. Let's be honest, global media powerhouses aren't neutral. They serve the interest of the same governments and corporations that benefit from keeping Africa down. So instead of spotlighting Traoré's courage, they buried it. Silence wasn't just Israel's move, it was the West's too. Western outlets have always had a playbook for Africa. Famine, warlords, corruption, disease. That's the Africa they're comfortable showing because it reinforces dependency. Oh, poor Africa, they need us. They can't survive without our aid. But an African leader standing tall at the UN, calling out Netanyahu and Western powers to their face, that's not the Africa they like to broadcast. That's an Africa that doesn't need saving. That's an Africa that demands equality. And equality doesn't sell aid packages. Here's the irony. Western media loves firebrand speeches as long as they're against America's enemies. When leaders from Venezuela, Cuba, or Iran call out the West, Western outlets cover it with dramatic headlines, framing them as radical or controversial. But at least it gets airtime. Traoré? Practically invisible. Why? Because he wasn't playing the usual Cold War script. He wasn't standing as a pawn of East versus West. He was standing for Africa itself. And that's more dangerous than any enemy state. But here's the kicker. Western media's shrug didn't kill the story. In fact, it made it stronger. Because Africans didn't need CNN to tell them what mattered. They had X, WhatsApp, Telegram, YouTube. On social media, Traoré's speech trended faster than any sanitized BBC segment ever could. The clips, the hashtags, the memes, all of it built an alternative media ecosystem, one the West couldn't control. It's a reminder that in today's world, virality matters more than airtime, and for once, Africa didn't wait for Western validation. By downplaying the story, Western media accidentally exposed themselves. Africans could see the double standard. They could see how stories of African instability get front-page treatment while African defiance gets ignored. And that realization fueled even more anger, more unity. The shrug was supposed to silence the moment. Instead, it became proof that Traoré was right. Because if the media really believed Africa was weak and irrelevant, why bother ignoring him? Why not mock him, criticize him, debate him? The silence, the shrug, revealed fear. Let's call this what it is, a narrative war. For centuries, Western media has controlled Africa's story. They decided what images defined the continent. They chose which leaders were reformers and which were dictators. They curated Africa for global consumption. But Traoré's speech bypassed them. He went straight to the people. And in doing so, he broke their monopoly on Africa's story. That's why the shrug wasn't just laziness, it was desperation. Here's the movie version. Imagine a giant newsroom in London or New York. Editors in suits, sipping lattes, flipping through stories. A junior producer says, "This speech from Burkina Faso was blowing up online." The editor glances at it and shrugs and says, "Skip it. No one cares about Burkina Faso." Cut to Africa. Streets buzzing, students chanting, farmers sharing clips on old Nokias, activists rallying with hashtags. Two worlds, one blind, one awake. That contrast tells you everything about whose story this really is. Here's the beautiful irony. Every time Western media ignores Africa's voice, it only makes Africans listen to themselves louder. Think about it. When the gatekeepers won't open the door, people build their own stage. That's what's happening now. The shrug wasn't the end of Traoré's message. It was the beginning of Africa telling its story, uncensored, unapologetic, unstoppable. Make no mistake,
The shrug of Western media will be remembered as a turning point, not because it silenced Africa, but because it revealed the cracks in their control. For young Africans especially, this is a wake-up call. Stop waiting for validation from the BBC or CNN. Stop letting others define your reality. The tools to tell your own story are already in your hands. That's revolutionary. So let's be clear. The shrug wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Western media tried to suffocate Traoré's fire by ignoring it, but instead, their silence became gasoline. The fire spread anyway, faster, hotter, and beyond their reach. Africa doesn't need the BBC to tell it what matters anymore. Africa decides for itself, and that's why this shrug will echo louder than any headline ever could. And if Western media's shrug revealed their fear, Traoré's next move revealed his vision. Because he didn't just reject colonial labels, he redefined what sovereignty means in the 21st century. And trust me, it's not the textbook version.
If there's one word politicians love to toss around at the UN, it's sovereignty. It's like the Swiss Army knife of diplomacy. Works in almost any sentence, sounds noble, and leaves people nodding even if they don't fully get what it means. But let's be honest, in practice, sovereignty often feels like a costume. Leaders say they're sovereign while foreign bases sit on their soil. They declare independence while their budgets depend on loans from the IMF. They wave their flags while signing trade deals that leave their people broke. And then came Ibrahim Traoré. He stood tall, looked the world in the eye, and basically said, "Forget your textbook definitions. Let me tell you what sovereignty actually means." And folks, this wasn't the UN's watered-down version. This was sovereignty with teeth. So what does sovereignty mean to him? Not speeches, not symbolic independence, but something far more raw and real. The right to decide who sets foot on your land, the right to choose who touches your resources, the right to say no without punishment, the right to stand tall and refuse to be bribed, bombed, or bullied. That's sovereignty. Not the illusion of freedom, not independence on paper, real, lived, unapologetic self-determination. And when he spelled it out, you could practically hear the centuries of colonial echoes rattling in the background. Take one example, military bases. For decades, Western powers have maintained bases across Africa, supposedly to help with security. But let's be honest, those bases serve their interests, not Africa's. They're staging grounds, listening posts, leverage tools. And Traoré called it out. Sovereignty means no more foreign bases without consent, no more security partnerships that look suspiciously like occupations. It was a bold line because foreign bases aren't just military symbols. They're political leashes, and cutting those leashes, that's sovereignty in action. Another example, Africa's resources. Everyone knows Africa is rich in gold, diamonds, oil, uranium, you name it. But somehow the continent is still painted as poor. Why? Because for generations, those resources have flowed outward, enriching others while leaving Africans struggling. Traoré's sovereignty meant breaking that cycle. No more deals where Africa sells raw materials for pennies and buys back finished goods for dollars. No more foreign corporations writing contracts that siphon wealth out of the continent. Sovereignty means Africa keeps what Africa produces. Full stop. But here's the deeper layer. Sovereignty isn't just about policies, it's about psychology. Colonialism didn't just take land and resources, it took confidence. It left nations second-guessing themselves, believing they needed approval from outside powers. Traoré's redefinition of sovereignty was a psychological slap in the face, a reminder that Africa doesn't need permission to breathe, to dream, to govern itself. That shift, from dependency to defiance, is more powerful than any economic reform, because once people believe in their sovereignty, everything else follows. Of course, sovereignty comes at a cost. When nations stand tall, the world often punishes them with sanctions. Look at Zimbabwe under Mugabe. Look at Cuba. Look at Iran. Independence comes with price tags. But Traoré's message was clear. Better hardship with dignity than comfort with chains.
Sovereignty isn't real if it only lasts until someone threatens your economy. It's sovereignty when you can look at the threat of sanctions and say, do your worst, we'll survive. Here's the key difference. Most leaders say sovereignty is important. Traoré is actually practicing it. He expelled foreign troops. He rejected exploitative deals. He built alliances with neighbors instead of begging for Western aid. That's sovereignty not as a slogan, but as a lifestyle. And that's why it resonates so strongly. For Africa's youth, this new definition is gold, because sovereignty, as Traoré describes it, matches their reality. They've grown up in an era of globalization where dependency feels suffocating. They're tech-savvy, proud, connected, and tired of being told their nations can't stand alone. Traoré gave them a definition of sovereignty that's not abstract. It's practical, personal, powerful. It says, this is your land, your future, your decision. And that's exactly the kind of message that sticks. Make no mistake, Traoré's redefinition of sovereignty is terrifying for global powers. Because if Africa adopts this definition wholesale, it changes everything. No more cheap access to resources, no more automatic military influence, no more one-sided trade deals. It levels the playing field, and when 1.4 billion people stand on level ground, the rest of the world has to take notice. Picture it like this. A dusty chessboard, pieces scattered. For centuries, foreign powers moved the pawns across the board. Africa was played, not playing. Then Traoré walks up, flips the board, and says, we're not pawns anymore. We're players, and from now on, we decide the moves. That's sovereignty redefined in real time. So let's be clear, Traoré didn't just use the word sovereignty. He rebuilt it brick by brick. He stripped away the diplomacy, the hypocrisy, the empty slogans, and gave it teeth. Sovereignty, in his vision, isn't something written on a UN charter. It's something you feel in your bones, something you defend with your fists if necessary, something that doesn't bend, doesn't bow, doesn't break. And that's why his redefinition hit so hard. It wasn't theory, it was truth. And then came the finale, the ultimate mic drop. After redefining sovereignty, after silencing Netanyahu, after rattling Western media, Traoré delivered his final warning. And it wasn't just a warning to Israel. It was to every power that ever thought Africa could be bullied.
Every great story needs a climax. Every revolution needs its rallying cry. And every fiery speech needs its mic drop moment, the line that freezes the room, chills the spine, and echoes long after the applause ends. For Ibrahim Traoré at the UN, that moment came when he stared into the global camera, narrowed his voice into steel, and declared, "Your time is up. Africa is waking up, and if you think you can bribe us, bomb us, or bully us, you're in for a surprise." Boom. That wasn't just a warning. That was a declaration of war against the old world order. Let's be real. Politicians issue warnings all the time. Sanctions here, embargoes there, the usual diplomatic threats dressed up in polite language. But Traoré's warning wasn't wrapped in diplomacy. It wasn't polite. It wasn't even negotiable. It was raw, defiant, and personal. The difference? This wasn't about Burkina Faso alone. It wasn't even about Netanyahu. This was Africa, a continent of 54 nations, 1.4 billion people standing up to centuries of exploitation. That makes it historic. Traoré's final warning boiled global politics down to 3 brutal tactics: bribes, the loans, the aid packages, the partnerships that come with hidden strings; bombs, the military interventions, the drone strikes, the foreign troops stationed for stability; and bullying, the sanctions, the threats, the political pressure designed to keep Africa in line. And then he rejected all 3. Flat out. That was the real shocker. Because for decades, one or all of those tactics have been enough to keep Africa compliant. And here was Traoré saying, not anymore. If you know your revolutionary history, you'll recognize the echo here. It's the same spirit as Thomas Sankara saying,
He who feeds you controls you. The same tone as Patrice Lumumba declaring independence from Belgium with fire in his voice. The same energy as Nelson Mandela refusing to bend under apartheid's threats. Traoré's warning wasn't new in essence, but it was new in timing. In a world shifting away from unipolar dominance, where the West no longer calls all the shots, his words carried extra weight. This wasn't just defiance, it was a prophecy. Make no mistake, when Traoré said your time is up, he wasn't talking about Netanyahu alone. He was talking about every foreign power that treated Africa like a chessboard. And that's terrifying, because power depends on perception. If Africa starts believing it can't be bullied, then bullying stops working. Think of it like a schoolyard. The bully keeps control as long as everyone believes in his strength. But the second someone smaller looks him in the eye and says, "Hit me and see what happens," the fear is broken. That's what Traoré did. He shattered the fear. Remember back in Fact 7 how Israel didn't respond? That silence made sense now. Because what could they possibly say? If they threatened him back, they'd prove his point. If they ignored him, they looked weak. Either way, Traoré won. And that silence turned his warning into something even bigger, a prophecy no one dared challenge. Picture the UN chamber as a movie scene. Traoré leans into the mic. His voice cuts like a blade. The words, "Your time is up," lands like hammer blows. Cut to the faces of diplomats, stiff, nervous, unsure whether to clap or pretend to take notes. Cut again to Africa. Students in Accra watching on phones, farmers in Bamako huddled around radios, activists in Johannesburg cheering in the streets. The energy is split. The powerful squirm, the people roar. That's cinema. But this wasn't fiction. This was history, live streamed. The reason his final words went viral wasn't just the defiance. It was the clarity. Most political speeches are foggy, layers of jargon, endless statistics, vague calls for cooperation. But Traoré boiled centuries of oppression down to one sentence. Bribe us, bomb us, or bully us, we won't bow. That clarity made it irresistible online. It became a quote, a slogan, a rallying cry, something that could fit on posters, hashtags, chants. And that's how revolution spread, not through essays, but through words simple enough to carry in your chest. For Africa's young majority, this warning was oxygen. They've grown up with leaders who either begged the West for crumbs or stayed silent in fear. Traoré broke that cycle. He gave them permission to demand dignity, to see themselves as equals, not dependents. That shift will echo for decades, because once a generation believes in its power, there's no going back. This warning wasn't just local, it rippled globally. To the West, it was a challenge. The old tactics won't work anymore. To Africa's neighbors, it was an invitation. Stand with us or stay sidelined. To the global South, it was inspiration. You don't need permission to stand tall. That's why leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea quickly echoed him, and why activists across Latin America and Asia shared his speech too. His warning wasn't regional, it was universal. And here's the kicker. The most terrifying part of his final warning is the what if. What if Africa actually follows through? What if the continent unites under that defiance? What if the bribes, bombs, and bullying actually stop working? The global balance of power would tilt. The empires of the past would crumble. The world would be forced to negotiate with Africa as an equal, not a resource pit. And that's not a maybe anymore. That's a when. So here's the question for you. Was this Traoré's final warning, or was it the first shot in a new global revolution? Because one thing's for sure, history doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it roars. And this roar came from the heart of Africa. If you want to keep hearing those roars, the shocks, the shifts, the untold truth the mainstream won't cover, then hit subscribe, smash that like button, and join us here on Global Pulse News. Because the old world is trembling, and the new one, it's already rising.